Welcome back to Viewpoint. I'm Maya Barry. Last week in a landmark decision, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled 5-4 that Washington, D.C.'s handgun ban violates the Second Amendment. The ruling has left many people wondering what it will mean for gun laws in other U.S. cities. Joining us with his analysis is Randy Barnett, professor of legal theory at Georgetown University Law Center. He's a graduate of Harvard Law School and has argued before the Ninth Circuit and the U.S. Supreme Court. He's the author of 7 books, including the award-winning book, Restoring the Lost Constitution, The Presumption of Liberty. Thank you so very much for joining us today.
Great to be here.
I want to start with a very basic question.
Sure.
Supreme Court decisions happen all the time. We don't necessarily talk about them here on Viewpoint. This really is a landmark decision.
This is as big as
Tell us why.
This is as big as they come. It's the first time in my lifetime, probably would be the only time in my lifetime, when the Supreme Court gets to tell us what the meaning of an important part of the text of the Constitution is without having any precedent standing in its way. It just is a case of first impression. It's part of the Lost Constitution. You said my book was called The Lost Constitution. So one of the reasons this is such a big deal is that this restored one little part of the Lost Constitution, which was the Second Amendment. It was gone for practical purposes, but now it's back.
Second Amendment, and I think our viewers can read it on screen here. We're talking about the ability, or the right.
The right of the people to keep and bear arms.
Right. Whether it applies as an individual right, whether it's a right related to a militia.
Correct.
So for our time as we know it, we have had...
Well, up until now, the lower courts, at least in recent years, have assumed that it was not an individual right that was protected. That's why I say it was part of the Lost Constitution. But now, as of today going forward, it is part of the Constitution, just the way the First Amendment's protection of freedom of speech and press is. It's a right that belongs to individuals to assert unconnected with their service in an organized militia, which is what the other side was arguing.
Tell me what this means for other states, because there's been a great deal of discussion about this is it, particularly the dissenting opinion, saying you've tossed everything up in the air, now we're going to see what happens.
Right. Well, there's 2 things everybody needs to know. First of all, this is a case only about federal law. The District of Columbia is a federal jurisdiction. So whether the right to keep and bear arms gets applied to the states is going to be a decision that has to be made in the future. That's really going to be a 14th Amendment question. The constraint,
states' rights issue.
The states' rights issue, whether the 14th Amendment applies the 14th Amendment is what applies to the states. So the question is the right to keep and bear arms protected by the 14th Amendment, not just the Second Amendment? Now, I do think that all signals in this opinion are that the court will eventually apply this to the states. And so I think that's probably going to happen eventually. It's going to take a long time before this case gets back to the Supreme Court. So that's thing number 1. Only federal. It'll have to be applied to the states in the future. The second thing is this involves pretty much the most extreme gun law in the country, a complete and total ban on a major popular class of firearms, handguns, and in fact a ban on having any operable firearm in your home that you could use for self-defense. So what's been struck down is a ban. Whether a regulation that is short of a ban, basically saying you can have a gun, but here, if you're going to have a gun, here's what you have to do. Whether a regulation short of a gun will be struck down as something, or how it will be scrutinized as something that we don't yet know. And there are very few gun bans in the United States. So even if the right to keep and bear arms does get applied to the states, most laws will probably be upheld.
Talk a bit about that for folks who want to understand our system better in terms of how we do this outright ban, the decision to have this be the test case. Explain that in terms of the process by which we kind of arrive at how we legislate.
Well, in this case, it's who brought the lawsuit, and a group of citizens brought a lawsuit, and I think they did for the reasons I've just suggested, because it's a clean federal case, doesn't involve the 14th Amendment, and it's an outright ban, which is not a regulation that might be deemed reasonable. So it was a clean case to bring, and they brought it. They won in the Ninth Circuit, in the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals, and now they've won in the Supreme Court. It was, by the way, a decision to bring this lawsuit was not promoted by the National Rifle Association, which I think was quite fearful that the Supreme Court would not rule the way it did.
I found that fascinating, reading that piece of it, that initially they thought there's no way this would go that way, so they wanted to...
Well, I'm sure they just were afraid, and no one really knew how Justice Kennedy was going to go until oral argument, which I was in the courtroom and watched, and sure enough, right out of the box, he really pretty much made his feelings known, and that pretty much everybody in the room then knew how things were going to go.
You know, related to that, I also thought it was interesting that the organization that would have wanted the ruling to go differently, there was a move to change this the D.C. law so that it wouldn't allow the Supreme Court to hear it. That didn't happen either. I mean, you really did have this confrontation.
Well, I think people will be second-guessing Mayor Fenty's decision to take this case to the Supreme Court. But, you know, he did what he did out of principle, and now we know what the law is, and part of the lost Constitution has been restored. But exactly what this means for future regulations, I think the only thing that we can be sure is that all gun regulations will now be scrutinized the way that restrictions like time, place, and manner regulations and speech are scrutinized. It doesn't mean they're all going to fail. Right. It just means that courts will now be empowered to take a look and make sure that they, in fact, are reasonable regulations.
We'd like to get you in onto the conversation. If you're calling from overseas, the number is 001-202-842-5056. From the U.S., it's 1-800-528-2090. And I'm going to say preemptively that you're not going to answer calls in Jerusalem. So we're moving a little quickly tonight.
Or South America.
That's right. Let's go back to, there was a great deal made about Justice Scalia's majority opinion, noting very specifically, this is wrong, this is unconstitutional, but the following, it's also not a free-for-all in terms of anyone can do anything in these following restrictions. How is that being perceived?
Well, look, I mean, one of the things that's in play here is that the gun rights organizations have been so effective in preventing unreasonable regulations from being implemented that the only regulations that are currently on the books could probably stand scrutiny. So really what this case will foreclose is more extreme gun laws than we currently have. And Justice Scalia was simply signaling what I think pretty much every advocate of the Second Amendment individual rights interpretation has long said, and that it is consistent with reasonable regulation, it's inconsistent with a ban, and it's inconsistent with arbitrary and capricious regulations, which are really intended to impose a burden on gun owners, not to reasonably regulate them.
Mayor Daley in Chicago was one of...
My old boss, actually.
Oh, really?
Well, I was a prosecutor there. I was a Cook County State's Attorney when he was the State's Attorney.
So that's even better then. One of his quotes was one of the first to come out and very quickly, adamantly saying this has been a horrible decision. And a lot of people are speculating that Chicago law is the next test, but particularly with the component you bring into it in terms of the 14th Amendment, states issue rights. What do you think happens next? Well,
I think the Chicago law is vulnerable, and I think a lawsuit's already been filed, and that lawsuit's going to go forward, and I think it's likely to succeed. In fact, I understand that Morton Grove and Skokie, who have similar bans, have now suspended the operation of their bans, so Chicago gets to defend this case all by itself, and Morton Grove and Skokie, two suburbs of Chicago, don't have to spend any money on the legal defense of their prohibition. The prohibition is now off the books.
How very nice of them. For our viewers who may not be as familiar with, frankly, what is politically the hot button issues for us here in the United States, how would you explain the issue of gun ownership? Well,
gun ownership is a very important part of American culture. I mean, I believe it's important that we respect the cultures of other countries, and I think it's also important for other countries to understand, at least, if not respect, the culture of the United States, which does place a premium on the individual's right to defend him or herself and be able to do so, and to own firearms in order to do that. And the Second Amendment was not an accident. And in fact, the 14th Amendment, when it was passed, one of the most important rights that the 14th Amendment was meant to protect was the right of freed blacks and Republicans in the South who were being murdered to protect themselves by using firearms, which the first gun control laws in this country were aimed at stopping. They were taking guns out of the hands of free blacks. So it's an important part of our culture. It is not inconsistent with reasonable regulation. You know, automobiles are an important part of our culture too, and they're also reasonably regulated, but that doesn't suggest that we ought to ban automobiles. I'm from Michigan. The discussion on emissions could go in the direction of a Supreme Court amendment any day.